I'd like first of all to acknowledge my graduate student, Zalala McConan, who is the guy who did a lot of the front-end graphics that you're going to see today. This study that we're doing is done as part of the North American Carbon Program. It's a project in which I've been able to get involved through my modeling work. And the objective of this program is to understand the impacts of climate and disturbance on the carbon balance of all terrestrial ecosystems in North America, and in a second, somewhat larger project across the world. So it's a little bit ambitious. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover all the details of this project today, but I'll do what I can to give you maybe just sort of a slice of some of the work that we're doing in this project. Okay, what are we trying to accomplish? Well, there's already widespread evidence that ecosystems in North America are responding to warming. This is supported by a lot of studies using remote sensing. Normalized difference vegetation indices studies show that there are increases in the length of the growing season. This is particularly at high latitudes where this is most important, and some of the work that I'll be showing will be Arctic work, because that's an area in which the warming is most intense, as I'll be demonstrating in just a while. Artificial warming experiments also suggest an increase in biomass. I've cited some studies, some of the main studies that have been done in this area, just for future reference. However, it's, although there's a suggestion of an increase in biomass, the work seems to indicate that there are regional variations in the response to warming, and that these regional variations may be attributed to species-specific responses at sites with different hydrology. So it's a complex process that we're looking at, a very complex response. Furthermore, a lot of tree ring studies in boreal forest indicate an increase in productivity with spring warming, but also in some areas declines in productivity with summer warming. This is particularly in coniferous ecosystems. So we're talking about a very complex response. It's not sort of a simple monotonic response to warming, so we need to bring some site-specific detail into these studies. So, what are the processes underlying this response that will then govern our modeling work? The response to warming can be divided into two basic types. There's a direct effect through the effect on CO2 fixation. Generally speaking, warming at lower temperatures improves the kinetics of CO2 fixation, but warming at higher temperatures often slows fixation through different effects on the biochemical processes. I won't go into that too much today, except to say that this forms the basis of the modeling of the responses that you're going to see in the maps that I'll show in just a little while. There's also a lot of indirect effects through respiration, water, nutrients, and phenology. Obviously, warming increases respiration. It can have an adverse effect on water status through effects on evapotranspiration. It can cause earlier phenology and longer growing seasons, as I noted earlier, has been indicated through the NDVI studies. It also, and very importantly, hastens the nutrient cycle. So this whole issue of soil decomposition and nitrogen mineralization that we've been talking about in the past presentation, that whole process is accelerated by warming. So again, all these processes we'll try to represent as accurate as we can in the modeling work upon which our observations will be based. So what are the impacts of warming on spatial and temporal trends in ecosystem productivity? What we're really asking here as part of this project is, what are the trends that are occurring in place already? Are these showing up in terms of, for example, major drought events? Can we detect major drought events in response to these changes in climate? Do they impact do these impacts affect the ability of ecosystems to sequester carbon? We've talked a lot about sequestering of carbon in the previous talk. We'll talk about more in the next talk. Okay, are the ability of ecosystems to sequester carbon affected by their different responses to warming? And here's a kind of a key question. What are the changes in active layer depth of permafrost regions that can be attributed to warming? This is a really big subject, and we'll be spending a bit of time on this, in part because it's an area of great interest, and also because in part it's where a lot of my funding comes from right now. But the second cause is probably a consequence of the first. What are the methods that we're going to follow? We're going to use a comprehensive mathematical model that I've developed over the last 25 years that tries to capture the detailed biological, biochemical, and biophysical processes that drive ecosystem productivity in response to climate and disturbance. This model requires some drivers. It requires information about conditions external to the model. It requires information about climates, so things like incoming long-wave and short-wave radiation, air, humidity, pressure, precipitation, temperature, humidity, temperature and wind speed. We're getting that now through a database called the North American Regional Reanalysis. We'll be looking at some results from that, but that's really the most current up-to-date climate record that we have for the past 30 years in North America. It's come out quite recently. A lot of people are starting to use it for climate studies, but it represents our best current estimate as a synthesis from the instrumental record across North America, our best current estimate for the last 30 years at a 3-hourly temporal resolution, our best estimate of the climate record for the region of study. We also have to account for rising CO2 concentrations. We have a database for that. Nitrogen deposition, this is quite a big deal over long terms. There is evidence that nitrogen deposition is increasing in a lot of North America, so we've got nitrogen deposition again in the model. A key thing for us here, the soil database. A lot of work has gone in now into synthesizing the databases, the soil databases that have arisen from years of soil survey in the United States, through the SSUR GO, the SURGRO in the US. Soil Landscapes of Canada version 3.2 has been synthesized into this database, as well as the Mexican database, because this is supposed to be a North American study. So SLC version 3.2 will play a key role in the results that I'll be showing later on. And some of the key variables, the soil layer file is really vital for our work. The dominant soil types, the sand, silt, clay, pH, organic carbon, CEC, and reference bulk density. So a lot of the key attributes in the soil layers file has been synthesized into this database and will be used in the results that we'll show. Do we have evidence of recent warming? What is the evidence for warming that is apparent in the North American Regional Reanalysis? Over here we have maps of North America. The left-hand map showing regional change. Showing regional change in temperature, where you see a yellow to a red. This indicates that there is an increasing trend of temperature over the last 30 years. Where you see a kind of a pale to dark blue is evidence over here of slight decreases in temperature, apparent in the record, again over the last 30 years, from 1979 to 2010. You can see that the warming is really concentrated in the high Arctic. It's really quite extraordinary. As you go further south, the warming is less apparent. I remember I was asked by a stockbroker a while back, do you really believe in all this global warming stuff? Because he kind of had a vague idea what I do for a living. And I said, put it this way, if the predictions that were made 20 years ago by climate change scientists, if you examine them today and observe the accuracy with which they've turned out, if some of your financial analysts could be half as accurate in their predictions, I could have retired by now. So yeah, you got a bit of a laugh out of that too. And yet people invest billions of dollars in their recommendations in spite of the extraordinary inaccuracies of some of their projections. Yet, you know, you still get a lot of skepticism over this. So we live in an irrational world. Over here are changes in precipitation. Very slight increases in precipitation over most of the North American landmass. Somewhat worryingly, though, trends towards slight decreases in precipitation and more pronounced decreases in precipitation in parts of the southern and southwestern U.S. So these are precipitation changes that are apparent. Now again, I want to emphasize these are not projections. These are what are emerging out of the last 30 years of weather data. If we want to sort of summarize these, if we look at sort of a south to north, we can see the change in temperature over the past 32 years, rising from about 0.5 of a degree through most of the middle latitudes, suddenly rising up to a rather considerable amount, 2 to 2.5 degrees in the far north. Similarly, if we look at changes in temperature going from west to east, it's pretty low in the western part, but it rises as you go east. I really have no idea why that is. Maybe the east is already cooler, so it's just catching up. I know I work with a lot of people who spend a lot of time in the Arctic studying climate and its impact on ecosystems, and they all universally assure me that the changes that are going on up there now are absolutely visible, absolutely apparent, and really quite disturbing. So it's really, this evidence of accelerated warming in the north is really supported by a lot of observations. If we summarize these trends in terms of degrees C per decade, we notice particularly in the Arctic, there's a rise of about 0.7 degrees per decade. This really seems extraordinary to me. So I'm a little bit surprised that it's actually that much. The values are obviously much lower in the southern and western areas, somewhat larger in the middle of North America, 0.3 to 0.4 degrees per decade. So that's really quite rapid. It's consistent with what long-term projections have indicated for the past 20 years. So what we're really seeing is the playing out of stuff that was estimated or projected 20 or so years ago in the early climate change reports. So the experiment is in progress. We also have to consider the effect of disturbance. Here we've got maps of we get forest fire maps from the U.S. Forest Service, the Canadian Forest Service. We get Canadian Wildfire Information System. We have to put this in because fire really has a key effect on the biological productivity of ecosystems. We do insert fire events into our model runs, which transfers a lot of carbon from living to dead. And there's a lot of studies upon which those transfers are based. U.S. land fire products. So there's a lot of that stuff that goes in. And then those all have to be harmonized and reprojected. Zalalam is quite a whiz at doing this kind of stuff, mercifully, because I have no clue as to how this is done. But he did it. I just said do this and he did it. And quite remarkable. Okay. How do we do our modeling runs? The spatial domain of our modeling runs will be 0.25 degrees. That's about 30 kilometers square. So we've got 30-kilometer grid cells. That creates about 50,000 grid cells across North America. So all those databases that I showed you earlier have been expressed at about a 30-kilometer spatial resolution across North America. So it's a lot of model runs. We have to represent different ecosystem types: coniferous and deciduous forests, C3, C4 grasslands, crops. We just have the three major crops. And then tundra, of course. And we're also going to put wetlands. We have a wetland. We have inputs which direct the model to simulate a wetland. That needs to go in next because those are key areas of carbon accumulation, as we were shown earlier earlier today. So we also have disturbances. We have to represent disturbance. Fire, I showed you in some of the previous overheads. We also have tillage, fertilizer, harvest. I won't have time to go into that level of detail, and we're still working out analyzing the outputs. Simulation period, all models have to spin up over a long period of time, so we have 210-year model runs. We use historical NARR data to simulate up to 1978, and then we use real-time weather data from 1979 to 2010. And that's the protocol. This is part of a larger model comparison project in which we're participating, and that's the protocol they came up with. Now, I want to just indicate that when we give model results, they're not just colors that appear in a map. You'll see enough of those already. Excuse me. We spent a lot of time testing our model against a range of detailed data collected at a range of sites across the continent. These are locations of eddy covariance flux towers at which CO2 and energy exchange is measured hour by hour from year to year in response to changes in climate, changes in disturbance, fire, logging, whatnot. There are grassland sites, there's agricultural sites. So we do a lot of detailed testing at these sites in order to ensure that our model is representing the response of ecosystems to carbon flux measurements at those sites. I'll just give an example of some of that. Okay, I'll give an example. Here we're looking at annual gross primary productivity derived from eddy covariance versus that which we model across a range of 25 sites for 2005. And we try to establish whether we can capture the range of productivity that you get in response to differences in climate and ecosystem type. We also test the output in more detail. I won't go into this to any great degree. This data is a little bit esoteric. Simply note that the daily exchange of carbon represented in the bottom graph, the little dots that you hopefully can see there, they represent the net carbon exchange modeled over a coniferous forest at Campbell River BC. This is one of our main sites in response to changes in temperature. Now these changes in these temperatures here come from the NARR. The temperatures here come from actual site measurements. So you can see the NAR, I was quite surprised at this. This regional gridded data, this is just from one of the 50,000 grid cells that happens to be located over Campbell River, actually tracks the temperature that we measure here fairly well. Notice there's a number of warming events, and those warming events are associated with sudden changes from in the forest from a very strong sink to a very strong source. You can see that here. This ecosystem switches from a sink to a source in response to these warming events here, which we found quite instructive. What we're trying to do in this study here is to see whether we get that same switching occurring. We captured in the model, we've got it very strong in the model when we run under ambient temperatures. If we run under the NARR temperatures from the gridded data set, are we able to reproduce that same behavior? Are the temperatures in the NAR sufficiently accurate to allow us to capture this response? And for this site they were. So I was quite impressed. I was quite encouraged with that. This is a cool year. Here's a warm year, an El Nino year. This is a bad fire year all along the west coast and through BC. Major forest fires. A number of very strong warming events here. And you can see how that really adversely affects the productivity of the forest. If you look at the green line, that's how we get it with the model using the site weather data. But you see, even with the black line, using the gridded data sets, we're still able to capture those effects. All right, we don't need to go into detail about this. I just want to say we do this at a lot of sites in order to make sure that we're capturing the sort of hour-to-hour and day-to-day variability in the carbon response, in the response of CO2, the response of productivity to changes in weather. Not all our sites were so accurate. There are some issues that did arise around the accuracy of the gridded data. I'll just mention that briefly before we move on. But our studies did indicate that if we look at the soil database, in this case the Soil Landscapes of Canada, in many cases soil properties are reported depths of only 1 meter, and this is really too shallow to represent the effects of soil hydrology on ecosystem water relations, particularly during drought. So when we develop these databases, we need to examine those soils which are actually deeper than 1 meter. They need to be represented, I guess, in some way to capture the full rooting depth of which these soils are capable. Another key limitation we found is that soil organic nitrogen is not reported in these data sets, although it's a key input to the model. Obviously, we need that to simulate the nitrogen cycle in the model. And although we did use generalized estimates of soil organic nitrogen based on soil organic carbon and assumed C to N ratios, that didn't always work at each site. Sometimes sites deviated significantly from the expected values because perhaps their site history, they were very poor in nitrogen or very rich in nitrogen, and this led to deviations in our model results that need to be rectified by getting better estimates of soil organic nitrogen into these data sets. In the NAR weather database, we generally had really good agreement with temperatures measured at the the eddy covariance sites across most temperate and boreal zones, but in the Arctic there tended to be an underrepresentation of temperature because the instrumental record is a lot more sparse. There are also issues around radiation, particularly in the north. Timing and intensity of precipitation was pretty good at a monthly time scale, but at a daily to capture those precipitation events, that still eludes the NARR to some extent. So again, I guess in subsequent iterations, maybe those will improve. But overall, we were pretty pleased with the NAR to represent weather data. We also test the model results at a continental scale against estimates from remote sensing and inverse modeling. So here we've got gross primary productivity across all of North America. These are in billions of tons. Gross primary productivity, net primary productivity, autotrophic and heterotrophic respiration, NEP, and then NBP after disturbance. And we get these values here for all of North America, average from 2002 to 2005. Here are other estimates coming from the North American Carbon Program through either direct bottom-up or top-down modeling. These are estimates for some of those same attributes from the MODIS Mode 17 product. These is a remotely sensed product or inferred from remotely sensed products. Carbon tracker, that is inverse modeling based on atmospheric measurements of CO2, CO2 inversion studies, again based on atmospheric measurements of CO2. All they can give you is a net biome productivity over the entire continent, and then this is a combination of inverse modeling and inventory reports in the early soccer from 2003. So I don't know, it's amazing that we all come within the same range, but we're able to test this range in much more detail using the modeling with its testing against the eddy covariance sites.